thou shalt not kill. Does this apply to animals or only to humans? We're going to look at some evidence today within the Bible of whether this is best interpreted as do not kill anyone, whether human or animal, or whether it's just don't kill humans or don't kill only a specific kind of human. It's Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. The King James says, thou shalt not kill. The New King James says, you shall not murder. Others say, do not kill, do not murder, something along those lines. And the word in Hebrew is ratsach, which means to dash in pieces. Who's that referring to? Who shouldn't be doing the dashing and who shouldn't be dashed is essentially the question. The first thing to do whenever we're trying to understand any particular passage is to look at the context of the passage and the surrounding passages. So the context of this passage is it's one of the 10 commandments that's being given. If we're unclear as to who this command is being given to and who the object of the command would be, then let's look at some of the other commandments and see if we get any clarity. Because a lot of these commands, they don't specify. They just say, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, etc. And they don't say steal from who or who shouldn't be doing the stealing. It just says do not steal, period. So we're left to figure out from the context who it's referring to. So if we look at Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, it gives us the Sabbath commandment, where it does mention who it's referring to. So it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your maidservant, nor your manservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or set it apart, as holy. So here it's very clear that it's not just for humans, that the Sabbath rest is also for animals. It says your cattle shall also rest on the Sabbath. And it says the origin of this instruction comes from the 6 days of creation, that in the beginning, this was his very good arrangement. So this first piece of evidence is that it's not just a commandment for humans, it's also a commandment for animals. That would be the conclusion that makes the most sense based on how it's elaborated in the other passages. Then if we look at verse 17, this is the last command. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So in the Sabbath commandment, the subject of the command would be humans and animals. And now here in this covet command, the object is both humans and animals. So animals are mentioned as the subject of the commandments and also the object of the commandments. So animals should not kill, and we should not kill animals. So it doesn't explicitly say that for the do not kill command, but it does explicitly say that in 2 of the other commands. So where it's ambiguous, we should infer that it's the same audience and the same subject and object that's being spoken of, where it is specified in the other commandments. That's just basic reading comprehension, and to read it the opposite way, to say, oh, those commands do have animals as subjects and objects, but the ones that don't specify must not. The contextual evidence does suggest that it would also be pertaining to animals. So of course, the rebuttal to this would be, what about all the instructions where God commands killing of animals? Isn't that proof that it doesn't apply to animals? If that's all the evidence that we have, then that would be. But if we look at all the evidence, there's that same evidence for humans as well, where just because it says do not kill humans, there's also commandments that can be found within the Tanakh, within the Old Testament, where it says kill humans. So the same argument would apply to humans, saying this doesn't apply to humans because elsewhere God says kill humans. And so that logic doesn't hold. So for instance, let's look at Leviticus 24, verse 16. And whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, the stranger as well as him who is born in the land. When he blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death. Okay? So if God says, do not kill, and that's only applying to humans, here he's saying if someone blasphemes God, you shall kill him. So to say there's an instance where he says kill animals, then that means it's not applying to animals. That same logic could be held true for humans. That since there's a passage that tells people kill humans, then he must not be talking about humans in this commandment where he says do not kill. But then if we look at what Jesus says, let's look at John chapter 8, verses 3 through. Now I want to start by prefacing that I'm aware that this account is not in some of the older manuscripts of John, so that's a separate debate, but just for the sake of showing that there is this evidence, let's start with John chapter 8, verse 3. Then the scribes and Pharisees brought him a woman, meaning they brought to Jesus this woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say?" This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw the stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So here, again, Jesus is going against this thing that's supposedly commanded by Moses, to stone someone committed adultery, where he's saying, I offer this forgiveness, this alternative to stoning. And so Jesus is offering something that is over and above what we might find written in Moses. So what about do not kill in general? There's 1 Samuel 15, verse 3, and this is pertaining to enemies. Verse 3 it says, "Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So totally annihilate all of Amalek and that entire population. That doesn't seem consistent with thou shalt not kill. So there's obviously a question of, was this really something that God did? And there's the whole debate about the documentary hypothesis and things like that. But without getting into that, I just want to show that Jesus seems to be teaching something different. Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 and 45. Jesus says, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." So here Jesus seems to be saying, don't even kill your enemies. That would be consistent with the command, do not kill. Whereas this other command that was supposedly instructed by God at the time of Moses, it said kill humans and animals and everyone. Okay, what about animal sacrifice? Because that's typically the one that people use where they say clearly God wasn't referring to killing animals because he commanded animal sacrifice. There's also an instance where God commanded human sacrifice according to these same scriptures. So that logic would not hold. There's a couple of instances, but this is the one that's most well known. Genesis 22, verse, "And he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you." So here you have God commanding a human sacrifice. And then if we look at Deuteronomy 12, verse 31, it says, "You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. For every abomination of the Lord which he hates they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods." Okay, so God is saying, do not sacrifice your children. That's not what I want. And yet here he's saying, sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. So the point that I'm making here is that if your argument is that there are these other passages in the Bible where God commands killing animals, and that's proof that thou shalt not kill does not apply to animals, that logic doesn't hold because there's the same types of passages with humans where he's saying to kill humans in all the same ways that he says to kill animals. And so that logic just doesn't apply. That would not work because that means thou shalt not kill doesn't apply to humans or animals. So how do we make sense of this? People usually point to Genesis 9, verses 2 to 6. This is the one where they say, God gave us permission to kill and eat animals, and so surely when he says do not kill, he's not suggesting we shouldn't kill animals, because otherwise why would he have given us permission to kill and eat them? Let's look at that passage. Let's look at Genesis chapter 9, verses 2 through 6. "And the fear of you and the dread of you will be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth. And on all the fish of the sea they are given into your hand." This is after the flood. "Every moving thing that lives will be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." So people point to this and they say, this is God giving us permission to kill and eat animals, which we actually did a separate live talk on this specific passage about whether or not that's actually what's going on. But regardless of what he's doing here or not doing here, there seems to be a contrast where here he's saying that the animals are all going to be afraid of you And in Genesis 8, verse 21, he says that you're following the own evil imagination of your heart. Of course, fear is not of God's plan, it's of the fall. And so just like when Adam and Eve first committed sin and they ate from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from, then they became afraid and tried to hide themselves. So that fear is not part of God's plan. So it's also in Habakkuk 2:17 that because of your violence toward the animals, they became afraid. And so here he's also inflicting punishment, where he says there will be this reckoning, this accounting for anyone who kills a person. And he says, kill an animal and eat its life because the life is its blood, or however that's phrased, depending on your translation. So there's this restriction on not eating the blood, but then you can't eat flesh without blood being contained in it because blood is part of what flesh is. And so there's all kinds of interpretations of what's really going on here. But the point here that people are making is they say, God gave us permission, and therefore thou shalt not kill can't apply to animals, because he's saying don't kill animals, but then he's saying you can kill animals. Let's look at his ideal. Let's look at what he originally said. Genesis 1, verse 29 through 31 says, And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the air, to every beast of the earth, bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And then it goes on to talk about that Sabbath rest, which, of course, the Ten Commandments, it specifies that that rest is for humans and animals, and it references at the creation because of the 6 days. And so if that's God's ideal, is for the Sabbath rest that applies also to animals, and we're only eating the fruit of the tree and the plants of the ground, and everything is very good, that's his ideal. And if we read the Ten Commandments as representing that ideal, they're all consistent with that ideal. Whereas these other passages that people are pointing to, these exceptions of killing animals, stoning people, committing genocide, human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, those are all inconsistent with God's ideal. And so usually those passages, they'll also involve things like God saying, you're following your own evil imagination, which is what it says in Genesis chapter 8 and 9. And he'll say other things that lead us to believe that that's not his ideal. And so we don't want to think, oh, just because there's a passage that suggests this means that's it. That's the conclusion, is that since God doesn't have this view of animals in every passage, that means we can't interpret thou shalt not kill as applying to animals. And let's look at some more evidence, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So regarding animal sacrifice, let's look at Exodus 20, verse 24. Because remember, Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. And so now we get to verse 24, and it says, An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. That's a closed case. Clearly he's not talking about animals, because later in that same chapter, he's asking for burnt offerings and sacrifices, right? Not exactly, because there's other passages that we have to consider. So let's start with Jeremiah 7, verse 22. He says, For I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt, the Exodus, concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. So here, the prophet Jeremiah is saying God didn't do those things. He did not command burnt offerings and sacrifices. But wait, didn't we just read, as he's bringing them out of the land of Egypt, that he's saying, build an altar and offer me burnt offerings and sacrifices? Again, just because there's a passage that says that doesn't mean that's originally what happened. We have to look at all of the context. And when Jeremiah is saying that's not what happened, that's an indication that something might be amiss. Let's look at a couple other passages, because right now we have one passage in Exodus and we have one passage in Jeremiah. Let's look at Psalm 40, verse 6. It says, Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. My ears you have opened. Burnt offering and sin offering you did not require. Okay, so God does not desire or require these animal sacrifices and these burnt offerings. This is the passage that Jesus loves to quote. He quotes it multiple times in the New Testament. So Isaiah 6, verse 6 says, For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So here there's multiple passages, and these are only just a sampling. There's several more where the prophets throughout the Old Testament are saying God did not command, did not require, did not ask for, and is not pleased with these animal sacrifices and these burnt offerings. And so just because there's some passages that depict God commanding animal sacrifice, that doesn't mean that's really what God was doing or that was his will. I think the best reading is either it's been corrupted by the lying pen of the scribe, that seems to be Jeremiah's view, or it was him meeting us where we were at, where they were committing these sins and they were sacrificing to other gods, and God was trying to meet them where they were at and pull them away from that evil. But regardless, if Jesus is our once-for-all sacrifice, then we shouldn't be thinking that God desires animal sacrifices at all. And I think that's what the Genesis 22 passage was referring to, because Jesus, according to John 3:16, he is that one and only Son that performs that once-for-all sacrifice. So how do we determine when there's scripture passages, some that suggest one thing and some that suggest a different thing? We don't want to just pick which one we want and go with that. But that's not the example that Jesus gives us. In fact, Jesus gives us the example of which one should take precedence over the others. So if we have some things in the books of Moses that say one thing, then we have some other things at the beginning of Genesis and in the prophets talking about the future, saying something different and the opposite, then which one should take precedence? Jesus tells us which one. Let's look at Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 8. The Pharisees also came to him, Jesus, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh?" Of course, he's quoting that first marriage in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve in Genesis. So he's quoting the very good world in the beginning. In verse 6, "So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" That he's quoting Deuteronomy 24:1, where Moses says, you find something about your wife, give her a certificate of divorce, and that you can divorce. And then Jesus responds in verse 8, he said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." So here, Jesus is saying there's this ideal that God established from the beginning, that that's his will. And it's because of the hardness of your hearts that there were some concessions made at the time of Moses, because they were not willing to do God's will, his ideal, what's really pleasing to God. And so there were some permissions or concessions or whatever you want to call that. And of course, in Jeremiah, he seems to suggest that these concessions weren't even made. So whatever your view is on that, I think the main takeaway is that we shouldn't look to certain passages in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy as God's eternal ideal and what he wants for us to do today, and interpret everything in light of those things. Instead, we should interpret those things as Jesus says to interpret them, which is in terms of the very good will in the beginning. And that sort of takes precedence over what might have been concessions later on because of the hardness of our hearts. And so how do we make sense of these 10 commandments then? Are these part of the ideal? They're in Exodus, though. They are part of the ideal, and they are all consistent with that ideal when we understand them as such. So let's look at Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 to 40. It says, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So the first one, he's quoting, I think it's Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. And then in the second commandment is Leviticus 19:18. So he's saying the first one is be wholeheartedly committed to God. Don't go after other gods. Don't bow down to idols. Don't blaspheme God's name. Those are the first 3 commandments, right? And then the next one he says is love your neighbor as yourself. Things like don't stealing from your neighbor, don't coveting your neighbor's possessions, don't kill your neighbor, do all those things. That sounds like commandments 5 through 10. And then of course the Sabbath commandment is the one that sort of joins both together. And that's the one that's specifically mentioning animals are also part of that. So what Jesus is doing here is he's essentially reducing the 10 commandments to 2 commandments. And he's saying this is all the law and the prophets. So the 10 commandments would be an expanded version of the central idea of these 2 commandments. And he says these are the 2 umbrella terms. On these 2 great commandments hang all of the commandments. And so in multiple places here, Jesus is establishing this ideal where he's saying this is what it's been from the beginning. And regardless of what sort of concessions might have been made along the way, those don't represent God's ideal. God's ideal is from the beginning. And so in the beginning, were we killing animals? No. In fact, in the verses that we read in Genesis 29 and 30 of chapter 1, they say, do not kill the animals to eat them. And if we look at the end, because of course the end and the beginning are essentially the same, where he's restoring, he says that I make known the end from the beginning. So Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6 through 9. So this is describing what that ideal looks like, what the Garden of Eden, that very good world that he establishes, what his intention is for this. So think about the 10 commandments. Would they fit with this description? The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion and the fatling together. And a little child will lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Okay, so who's not hurting or destroying who? Nobody's hurting or destroying anyone. So who would be not killing according to that commandment? Nobody would be hurting or killing anyone, and nobody would be killed or hurt or destroyed. So if we understand God's very good will from the very beginning to the end, and that's what Jesus says to do, he says don't prioritize certain concessions or permissions that might have been made at the time of Moses due to the hardness of people's hearts, but rather look to the very beginning as the ideal and how to interpret his overall law, his overall will. And so when it comes to understanding the 10 commandments, so that's an expanded version of what Jesus says are the 2 commandments, to love God and love neighbor. And so the 10 commandments, best understood, would fit with this vision in Isaiah chapter 11 and would fit with the depiction of God's very good world in Genesis 1 and 2. And that only works if thou shalt not kill also applies to animals. Because if it doesn't apply to animals, then we're falling short of both of these ideals. So just to close, let's go back to Exodus chapter 20. And if we remember verses 8 through 11, toward the end of it, in verse 11, it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So these 10 commandments are explicitly saying that these commandments are justified because this commandment was established at the very beginning, before sin entered the world. He's talking about Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. So from the very beginning, this was established. And so from the very beginning, these commandments essentially were established. And in that very beginning, we were not killing animals, we were not killing people. Nobody was killing. There was no death and no sin. And in the end, that will be restored and reestablished. And so any sort of permission that may or may not have been granted in the interim was due to the evil or the hardness of our hearts. But we shouldn't strive to do the things that we may or may not be permitted to do. We should strive for God's ideal, what is best in his eyes. And Jesus makes it clear that ideal is according with the Garden of Eden. And so our understanding of the 10 commandments, we shouldn't see them through the eyes of hard-heartedness and corruption. We should read them through the eyes of God's very good ideal. And when we do so, thou shalt not kill definitely applies also to animals.